All right. We will now meet a speaker who has been involved in the effective altruism community for almost 10 years and who has been an animal advocate her whole life. Today, she is the executive director of animal charity Evaluators, a nonprofit which finds and promotes the most effective ways to help animals. It's a pleasure to welcome up on stage Leah, Edgerton.
I think I pushed the wrong button. Oh, okay. All right. So, I'd like to start out today with a thought experiment. What if the effective altruism movement were to become mainstream? What changes would we see? Would we see perhaps hipsters walking around with Peter Singer t-shirts instead of Ramones t-shirts? Would we see the primetime television slots going to prediction tournaments instead of football matches? More seriously, what characteristics would we want to change in our movement that we have today? Thinking on the margin is a very different exercise when we're talking about influencing less than 1% of the movement's funding compared to when we're influencing, say, 10 or 20 or 30% of our movement's funding. And this may seem like a fun exercise, but in fact it's become somewhat of a reality for those of us working in the effective animal advocacy movement. Perhaps the most striking metric by which to track the growth of influence of EA within animal advocacy is by looking at the growth of influence of EA funding within the farmed animal advocacy movement. So if we look at 2014, to the best of my knowledge, ACE was the only EA organization influencing funding within animal advocacy at that time. We moved less than $150,000, and it's difficult to know exactly what the global farmed animal advocacy movement's budget was at the time, but my best estimates put that our influence was something between 0.0015 and 0.003% of the movement's total funding. Fast forward to 2018, and we see a very different picture. Last year, ACE and Open Philanthropy Project and the Center for Effective Altruism together influenced approximately $40 million, which out of the estimate of $165 million global farm animal advocacy budget adds up to 25%. As a fun aside, I just did some quick numbers for the global health and development sector, and the combined giving of GiveWell, The Life You Can Save, and CEA and Open Phil adds up to about $275 million, or about 0.01% of the humanitarian aid budget. That's from 2017. So I'd like to share today some of the features of the effective animal advocacy cause area that are a little bit unique and that inform our strategies in ways that has formed our interventions to look a little bit different than those that are taking place in other EA cause areas. The two main considerations that I'd like to point out are one that, of course, affects all EA cause areas, the lack of evidence, although I'll argue that it's particularly strong in our cause area. And, as I mentioned, the fact that EAs have grown to have a relatively large influence within our sphere. So, within our cause area, there are very few studies existing about almost any of the interventions that are used routinely by advocates in our fields. The studies that do exist are generally lacking in control groups, which makes it difficult to infer causality. Oftentimes, they're also, perhaps due to underfunding, they're underpowered, which means that they have smaller sample sizes, and we're unable to detect the types of effect that we're looking for. And more fundamentally, the types of effect that we're looking for, most notably dietary behavior change is notoriously difficult to measure. We're often reliant on self-reported data, which, as we know, is really an unreliable predictor of actual behavior. ACE's approach to handling this dilemma has been to increase the amount of evidence available. Seems like a simple solution. We have our own experimental research team, our own core research team who conduct experimental studies and literature reviews and case studies on the most pressing questions to inform animal advocates in our movement. We also have Animal Advocacy Research Fund, which was founded in 2016, and to date has funded 37 studies, mostly focusing on intervention research and foundational research and movement growth questions. We also have a collaboration directory, which pairs animal advocates who have research questions with researchers and academics who have the expertise in order to be able to answer them. We also have a data repository where researchers can upload the raw data of all their studies and keep it transparent for everyone to use. We have a research library where advocates can access the existing research that does already exist on effective animal advocacy. And we've hosted a couple of events, such as the 2016 symposium and our 2017 research workshop, which brought together researchers and animal advocates to collaborate on new research projects. More fundamentally, we've been trying to move beyond the limitations of self-reported dietary data, and there are some really exciting studies underway that are using actual behavior data from purchasing data from supermarkets and institutional dining facilities in order to measure actual behavior change. We've also made an effort to consult the full range of evidence available to us. We all know that randomized controlled trials are the gold standard of evidence, but we've also made an effort where evidence is lacking in those areas to consider things like historical data, sociological data, case studies, and so on in order to inform our intervention research. And we've also made an effort to consult a wider range of perspectives. So that means like interviewing advocates from the animal advocacy movement who are approaching the problem from different angles. I'd like to take a moment to talk about a well-founded potential critique to this type of approach. As soon as we open ourselves up to more qualitative data, we're also opening up ourselves to more subjective calls. And these subjective judgment calls come with a risk of bias towards the types of activities that we're already doing. So we might be justified to say that what we're already doing is the most effective, which is a risk that we don't get with stronger empirical studies. But however, I'd also like to point out that more quantitative studies come with a different set of risks. The risks of quantitative studies are that we might be biased towards researching and promoting interventions for which data is easiest to gather. So we might be missing out, for example, on interventions that are very effective indirectly, but whose results are difficult to measure, or interventions that have very powerful effects over the long term in which we don't have the timeline available to study them. So I'd like to move back to the relatively large influence that we have, the second feature of our movement. So it's been a real success story, so I hesitate to call this a problem, but I would say that in the last 5 years, conversations around EA principles are now taking place quite literally at the center stage of our animal advocacy movement's largest conferences. Advocates are asking questions about cause prioritization within the movement, about cost effectiveness of different interventions, and about how to best use the empirical evidence that we do have to inform our strategy. And I've seen volunteers asking questions about where their marginal impacts can be most effective. A few organizations in our field have shifted their focus in order to improve their marginal effectiveness. And donors are increasingly requesting that charities provide information about impact, and then that in turn is leading to more informed giving decisions within our field. While this growth of influence of EA within animal advocacy is definitely a success story, and I'd also like to credit several of the people in this room for making that happen, to quote Spider-Man, "With great power comes great responsibility." So thinking on the margin when you're controlling less than 0.01% of a movement's funding is a very different exercise, and you get a very meaningfully different answer than when you ask, what should we be doing with 25% of our movement's funding? Compound that with a lack of evidence in our fields, and you can see the importance of proceeding carefully. Our approach to dealing with this has been to prioritize the health of the movement as a whole, in addition to promoting individual interventions and organizations that we think are particularly promising. In practice, this means allocating resources to more organizations rather than fewer. It means using lower standards of evidence for interventions that we think are particularly likely to be promising, but particularly difficult to measure. And it means having a higher tolerance of risk. Our concrete projects that show this in action are, for example, our recommended charity fund, which, in addition to allocating resources to our top charities, also allocates resources to our standout charities, so spreading, so that means, allocating resources towards more charities rather than fewer. And then a much stronger step in that direction is our newly founded Effective Animal Advocacy Fund. We launched that fund in the second half of 2018, and this fund is aimed at supporting a broader scope of charities beyond our top and standout charity selections. A lot of these are working in particularly neglected areas, or they have a shorter track record. And some of the areas they're working in are policy work, movement building in neglected geographical regions, movement building in neglected demographic populations, fish welfare, and wild animal suffering. The first round of funding for this fund raised about $2 million at the end of 2018, and we also solicited over 100 grant applications. So stay tuned, the results of the first allocations will be announced in the next week or two. More generally, we've worked to better understand the role that diversity, equity, and inclusion play in capacity building within our field. We theorize that on a movement level, having a diverse set of actors and a diverse set of approaches makes us more likely to be effective over the long term. Reducing animal suffering is an extremely complex issue. It spans the entire globe, and it affects people's behavior and attitudes on a fundamental level. It's something that's very difficult to change over short-term timelines. So we think that having a global movement with a diverse set of actors and a diverse set of approaches will make us better able to overcome the obstacles that will inevitably arise. These types of considerations have led us to prioritize within our charity evaluations movement health by asking organizations to report on organizational culture. And we've also made a deliberate effort to support those who are seeking to improve the equity and inclusion of our current movement. Working with a broad set of actors is not just useful for its direct impact, but also as an investment in the collection of future research. We think that working with a wider range of interventions will allow us to learn more about them. And we also think that there's value in bringing a larger amount of charities into contact with ACE's work and with EA principles more generally. I'd like to take a moment here to acknowledge a potential risk of this approach. Heterogeneous groups, or groups where there's lots of different lines of thinking, are more prone to risks such as conflict or mission drift, or even fragmentation and disillusion. And I want to acknowledge that these are things that are very real for the effective animal advocacy movement and for which we've already seen the signs of small things happening. But I'd also like to take a moment to explore whether these are really quite as bad as we think they are. For example, is it that conflict could bring about necessary change? And is it that mission drift could lead us towards a new mission that preserves the strengths of the current EAA movement, but overcomes some of its current limitations? And it's also possible that fragmentation or dissolution of our movement could lead to the formation of multiple separate movements that accomplish more together than our current movement can accomplish today. We think it's important to manage these risks as best as possible, but that the benefits of including a broader set of approaches within our movement is worth the potential negative risks. Circling back to our original question, how would we want the characteristics of our movement to change if EAA were to become more mainstream? The EA movement has seen significant growth and influence within the animal advocacy cause area over the last 5 years. The positive impact is notable, but the increased responsibility that comes with increased influence is something that we need to take seriously. So given the space that we're operating in, our approach has been to increase the amount of evidence that we have to work with to inform our strategy, and to prioritize effectiveness on a movement level in addition to promoting particular interventions and organizations that we think are effective. I'd like to end today by sharing some practical tips. For those of you who are interested in getting involved in the animal advocacy movement, I recommend looking into volunteer or internship or job opportunities with ACE or any of our recommended charities. And I also want to point out that my colleague Caroline and I are here for the rest of the day, and we would love to continue this conversation further with you. So thank you today for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions.